Welcome to Mission Undercover. Joining me today is journalist and best-selling author Jay Heinrichs. He has written about the art of rhetoric and persuasion, and that is exactly what we are going to discuss. We will also explore ideas of Stoicism, personality, and human psychology. Could you start by telling me about your journey and what actually led you to where you are today?
Well, I'll start at the very beginning. I was a big reader when I was a kid. Frankly, not a very good student. Hung out in the library, and I would just the local public library, and would pull down books at random, um, just to see what was in them. All along, though, I came to realize that words have power. I mean, you think about it, soldiers sacrifice their lives because of words. People do things they regret the next morning because of words. And so I wanted to know what that power was. But school didn't teach me that. And I went to a very good college because my mother had gone there. That's how I got in. I went to graduate school, dropped out quickly because I realized academia and I wouldn't get along very well. All throughout, I tried to find the power of words. I mean, in graduate school, I was going to get a PhD, a combined PhD in English and political science, thinking that's where the power lies. It wasn't until I became an administrator at Dartmouth College, an Ivy League university here in New Hampshire, where I live, uh, and I was bored in my job, spending long lunch hours in the wonderful open stacks of the Dartmouth College Library. And that's when I found a book, 2 volumes, written by a man who was to become a future president of the United States, John Quincy Adams, who was 38 years old at the time and a professor of rhetoric and oratory at Harvard. And these books were a collection of these lectures he gave to first year students at Harvard, all teenagers for the most part, but future masters of the universe. I mean, America was growing very rapidly, and these people were going to lead it. Uh, Adams told me when I opened the book, and I think what had caught my eye, this was in a part of the stacks that was covered with cobwebs. Half these fluorescent bulbs had been burned out. And I thought, who has not been here for years? What is this topic? And when I opened this book, which was bound in red leather, unlike the others, which were like gray and black, and had been signed by John Quincy Adams, he told me in that first lecture to take from the relics of ancient oratory those unresisted powers which mold the mind of man to the will of the speaker and yield the guidance of the nation to the dominion of the voice. And once I got past the Victorian language, I realized that Adams was offering me something I'd been looking for all my life. So for the next couple of decades, while I had legitimate jobs, mostly in publishing magazines for the most part, I drove my family crazy, studying everything I could of rhetoric, bothering rhetoricians and linguists around the world. And finally, my wife told me to quit my job and write a book. So honestly, my first book in rhetoric, Thank You for Arguing, was written because my wife told me to.
I found it interesting that you mentioned the power of words. And I was listening to Andy Burnham, the UK Prime Minister, talking about this very same thing whilst quoting lines of poetry last week on a podcast. So I think it's quite interesting that we have someone who actually appreciates the power of words. He's an English literature graduate. And I think it's actually really interesting that both old language and new language have a different type of power. They both have power, but in different ways, right? So new language is more broken up, more fragmented, and more relatable, and that has the power of connecting people more. The old language is more deep and profound, and it connects people more to profound understandings of things. So I thought that was actually interesting as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to speak to that because I think you make a very important point here. The current what you call new language has developed really over the past century and a half. I mean, it hasn't been sudden. It's been influenced highly by social media, but the kind of language, the informal language we speak to one another, doesn't just connect; it divides as well because we all have our own way of speaking, our own use of terms, and some terms are forbidden in some groups, and some are allowed, by other groups. And I think what's happened is when people try to speak a language that doesn't match this increasingly tribal culture within the tribes, we get in trouble. And I think you see that on a lot of levels right now. A lot of times, particularly the Democrats, try to speak with the old language, trying to speak like John F. Kennedy in this highly poetic kind of speech. And it really moves some people, but it turns off other people as well. Whereas for the most part, Republicans tend to speak in blunter terms. They use tropes, which are actually kind of manipulative sort of language, but sound like they're more shooting straight from the hip. Democrats are catching on to that. And you can see, particularly among the progressives, that they're speaking less and less formally. Whether that works and whether it does society any good, it's up to you. You tell me.
I think we saw this contrast in old and new language in India as well recently with the cockroach movement. The difference between this movement and the reason that this got such mass popularity and scale is because it didn't use grandiose and fancy language that appealed to the educated classes. It appealed to all segments of society by using something more simple, not using old Urdu poetry that barely anyone could understand or resonate with. So I think that these contrasts in language are really powerful and they can be used both in politics and in personal life as well. I want to talk more about your book that you wrote. Thank you for arguing. You explained how historical figures mastered the art of persuasion. Who do you think was the best orator that you've ever seen in history, that we've ever seen? And what made them so special and so successful?
The answer to every question like that is that depends. What you mean by rhetoric, what you mean by artistry. So I'll tell you, one of the ways to measure how well rhetoric works is how well it succeeds, right? Now, one of the things that tend to mislead people is that they think that speeches are the most persuasive rhetorical act, and generally they're not. Most speeches really do nothing. They're expected. They're an occasion. Now and then they can be really entertaining, especially if you go on YouTube and you see commencement speeches by comedians and great minds. They can be terrific. Do they really influence people? Do they change the culture or change politics? Only rarely. And so if you look at Martin Luther King, the who, by the way, I would rank really high among the most effective users of rhetoric. His most famous speech, his I Have a Dream speech, much of which he ad-libbed, he didn't write it in advance, I argue was less effective in terms of changing the culture and the politics than the letter he wrote from Birmingham prison, where he spoke to the higher values of the white elites and said, you're not living up to them. That changed things. That changed a lot of people. That was brilliant rhetoric, and he never spoke it. It was a letter. He mailed it. Now, on the other hand, if you look at someone like an Abraham Lincoln or a Barack Obama, their careers were launched, each of them, by a single speech. One by Abraham Lincoln in New York City to a group of wealthy elites who were very skeptical of this hick from Illinois, Kentucky by way of Illinois, who spoke in this kind of whiny voice with this horrible accent, and then proceeded to give this brilliant speech showing his mastery of not just politics, but economics and culture. And then Barack Obama in the Democratic convention, who is such a nobody as a state senator that security thought that he was an intern or something, wouldn't let him in. With that speech, he launched himself into the U.S. Senate and then the presidency. So sometimes these speeches do work. Now, you could say, on the other hand, a lot of rhetoric comes from effective use of social media. And the first person truly to master that, at least in America, on a mass scale, was Donald Trump, who mastered television and then went on to master Twitter. Speaking in, you spoke about how the new language is more broken up. Nobody breaks up language more than this guy does. He speaks in a series of non sequiturs, often doesn't even make sense. And yet he has in what in rhetoric we call an ethos appeal. And so it's often called an ethical appeal, but that misleads people because Trump is anything but ethical. He is using his force of character as people perceive it in order to persuade. So I just mentioned 4 different kinds of rhetoric, all of them used very effectively by particular people. And I haven't even talked about how women have used rhetoric. Maybe that could be part of the discussion later.
So you mentioned that politicians and public figures mainly use speech and debate as a format of trying to convince people, but that's not really effective, right? And I think that different people find it effective because people who are interested in politics and people who are involved in politics, like other cabinet ministers, like other politicians, or people who are just genuinely invested in politics, would feel convinced by a speech or a debate. But ordinary people who are more detached from it, they wouldn't necessarily feel that. And we saw that with a former UK Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. He was able to stir up so much emotion and convince his own people within his own party to support him and get behind his vision. But sometimes he couldn't do the same with the public. So how do you think that a politician can actually use a format that actually appeals to broader society rather than just engaging in this confrontational, one-dimensional approach of speech and debate, which doesn't really encourage collaboration and supporting your views with other people's thinking?
That's such a good question. It's a difficult one. One of the problems that politicians have in terms of rhetoric is the more divided the culture is, the less advantageous rhetoric that appeals to everyone becomes. And I mean, this is counterintuitive, I know, but basically, if you've got a very divided electorate, as you do in your country, as well as in America, then activating the people who are already for you, not necessarily the true believers, but the ones who kind of like you, or the very few people who might be persuaded onto your side. The kind of rhetoric that appeals people to take action, including going to the polls or giving money or telling other people to go to the polls, that kind of language tends to be more extremist and more one-sided. And that's what you're seeing in politics in general around the world today. And there's good reason for that. You get elected this way. Now, on the other hand, if you take a more moderate, middle of the road path, you try to be inspirational somehow, good luck with that. It generally doesn't work. And, even inspirational speeches that people absolutely love, they forget within 15 minutes. And so, unless it becomes literature studied in high school, like the Martin Luther King's Dream speech or Gandhi's speeches, the problem is the divided culture. The problem is not the kind of rhetoric that's used today. Now, one thing that I've got to mention when it comes to informal versus formal speech, informal speech has been around forever. Jesus spoke in a highly informal speech. In fact, a lot of the educated Romans, when they first heard about this guy, really thought he wasn't worth listening to because his language wasn't great. Now, if you look at populists throughout the centuries, they tend to speak highly informally. Martin Luther, not King, but Martin Luther, the guy who created Lutheranism and the Protestant movement against the Roman Catholic Church in Germany, spoke in not just informal language, but obscene language. I mean, he used very offensive language. He was big on bodily functions and spoke about them, pretty openly. So I don't think this whole informality is new necessarily. It's just that during a divided culture, populists tend to spring up and they speak language that is more familiar to their supporters.
It's also because in the current electoral climate, people are unlikely to switch their allegiance because they're so dug into the support of whoever they support, right? It's almost fanatical. You see that with Trump, with Farage, whatever these populist type of people are. Nothing is going to convince them. No matter what you do, you're not going to convince them. So that just incentivizes politicians to continue appealing to their segment and to their group of people that support their ideas.
Yeah.
Now I want to talk more about your other book called Word Hero, which explored how to craft memorable lines. What's the most powerful and memorable quote or saying that you've heard, and what made that so memorable? Maybe you could say again, I have a dream, but I think there could be something that's more powerful.
Well, I'll tell you one line Democrats have been trying to equal ever since was John F. Kennedy's chiasmus, which is a figure of speech that takes a phrase or a clause and then turns it around. So it was John F. Kennedy who said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And first of all, it's a great, noble thought. It's perfect for an inaugural address, which it was. He's basically saying we're all in this together, but don't expect, the things to be done for you, where you have to work for this democracy we've created. The chiasmus is really great because it says, you can think this way, but you also need to think that way. It's the mirror image. And by the way, the chi in Greece, they were the ones who invented this, or at least named this figure, is an X. So the chiasmus is the X figure. It's my favorite. So it's the one best used. Now, George W. Bush used a really great trope, on the other hand. So a figure of speech is an unusual use of language. It's either unusual use of words or a pattern of words. A trope, on the other hand, sort of changes reality. It pretends things. And we know what a metaphor is, right? If I say the moon is a balloon, people aren't thinking I'm on some kind of drugs. They're thinking I'm making a metaphor. Some metaphors aren't well known and they're more effective as a result. So George W. Bush, when he was talking about invading Iraq some years ago, said there will be boots on the ground. Now, that is a metonymy. You could also say it's a synecdomy, but let's not split differences here. Now, he wasn't talking about people throwing boots out of helicopters onto, the Iraqi desert. He was talking about soldiers. But actually, when you think about when he said boots on the ground, he actually meant huge logistics, airplanes, trucks, anything but boots. Boots were a relatively small concern. That led to another trope, very similar, called shovel-ready projects. When you say a project is shovel-ready, it means all the permits are signed or whatever. And the one trope influenced the other. They're very misleading and very manipulative, because when Bush said boots on the ground, he implied that they were better prepared than they were for that war. When people say this project is shovel ready, it rarely is, and there's never a shovel involved. So those are two very effective uses, one of a figure and one of a trope. I write about in Word Hero.
I think in Britain, there's been three main phrases, right, that have been so powerful and become embedded in the public consciousness. Two of them are quite right wing, and one of them is left wing. So the first was for the many, not the few. That's become quite powerful phrase and statement symbol on the left. And then for the right, Brexit means Brexit. And then the third one, take back control. These three phrases have become so embedded in our politics and our discourse, and they've become really powerful to use both on the left and the right. And I think both sides are trying to reclaim each of those for their own sides. So I think that something as simple as that, or something powerful and declarative like that, I think that also has its own value and its own power.
Absolutely. And you know what? All of them have some common elements. They're all different figures. But if you look at, say, take back control, it's a rhythmic expression that's related to what the ancient Greeks called a paean, which was the original war cry. The paean was the god of healing. And so when soldiers would go into battle, they pray to this god, saying, please don't let me die. And so that became known as a paean. And pretty soon it turned into let's kill the enemy. And that was also called a paean. So a paean is now considered to be a speech of praise for someone. But actually, as a figure, it's really interesting because Marcus Tullius Cicero, and I'm a geek. I'm going to get into the weeds here rhetorically. Cicero was this great Roman orator and rhetorician, theoretician of rhetoric. And he talked about the use of short and long syllables used creatively. And that's how he described a paean. Take back control. You think about that, it's almost like bullets. I mean, it's boom, 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 boom. That's a great rhythm. And a perfect paean is something like what nerdy Ivy Leaguers say during a basketball game. They like to chant, repel them, make them relinquish the ball. And you could hear that's long syllables, short syllables, and a kind of rhythm as well. All of what you just mentioned have that same kind of effect of short and long syllables. Um, when you say for the many, not the few, did I say that right?
Yeah.
Um, that is interesting in that it has a reversal in it, not this but this, and that's a particular kind of figure that can be very effective. Not this but that, and you see that in advertising campaigns all the time. It's a similar thing: eat this, not that. And that's, again, the combination of syllables and these very short, sort of rhythmically recognizable phrases really catch on with people. Now, in this country, Democrats are too often do exactly the opposite. They're going to speak cinematically and with these flowing periods, as we say in rhetoric. And people don't remember them because it's not something they can chant on the street.
So we've discussed a lot about populism and about politics throughout this discussion. So I think we need to discuss a really pressing and important matter, which is how do we stop the rise of populism? How do we stop these very effective communicators and rhetoricians like Donald Trump, like Nigel Farage? How do we stop them from being able to manipulate voters through just their rhetoric? Because that's basically all it is. They come up with their man of the people style just from the way they speak. There's not really much substance there. So how do we actually confront that as a form of public discourse? How do we actually stop that from having an effect on society?
I love that question, and I have my own take on this for what it's worth. I mean, I'm not a person in power, and I will never be president or prime minister. But on the other hand, I do deeply believe that rhetoric is not the answer. And here I am. I'm a rhetoric guy. I think rhetoric can be really useful in everything from a private meeting to a one-on-one negotiation. But ultimately, it will not stop the kind of evil populism that a Farage represents or a Trump. Organization will do that. And one of the problems that we have is that people who want to resist tend to take the easy way out, and the easy way doesn't work. If you look you look at how people will often take the streets in March, right, when they want to resist something. Now, if enough people do that, and if a diverse enough group does that, that can actually change things. And we saw that in the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic. I mean, you could see it around the world. The Arab Spring briefly did that. But the problem is you need organization. You need to form groups of people. Now, rhetoric can help you convince people to be part of your group. And that can be very important. But you're going to be using the same populist tools, the same rhetorical tools to do that. Organization wins, ultimately. If you look at the Russian Revolution, it's a great example of this. There were some terrific speeches being said. People were quoting Karl Marx, who wrote some terrific stuff. But it didn't go anywhere. It was organization that won the Russian Revolution. And ultimately, that's what overturns people for good. So when you talk about the language being trivial or empty and not serious, not really dealing with the kind of policy that genuinely helps people, that's where you get organization, where people can disagree with one another and make plans without wanting to kill each other.
Okay, so there's two questions to finish off this section. You mentioned that you want to discuss a bit more about how women use rhetoric in public life. And so I want to ask you, how is it different when a woman is trying to do something like populism or just in general trying to use rhetoric to persuade people? You could see maybe an example of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, the populist Italian leader. And then also I wanted to ask, what is your most controversial opinion?
What's my most controversial opinion? I have to think about that. Wow. Let me start with the most controversial opinion. I think people are, especially on the left, are running into a disastrous opinion of artificial intelligence. So I think that's my most I get flamed for this all the time. I actually think that AI is not only a powerful tool, but it can actually help us bring civilization forward. How's that for controversy? And, I get understandable resistance to this and a lot of anger saying, well, okay, what about these giant server farms throughout America, which are using water and electricity? What about the manipulation that comes from this? What about the alignment problem where these robots are going to take over and decide that humans are inferior and kill us all? What about the weapons, that can be self-reliant and kill people without a human intervention? All these things, I argue, are human problems that can be solved with really good debate. And if people who say, well, I'm never going to use AI are talking nonsense, because they are. If they're using email, they're using AI. If they're using a computer, they're using AI enabled or created software. Anyway, that's my most controversial opinion.
I also think that people don't realize that AI used to exist before ChatGPT as well, and that AI was a big part of technology before that as well. So I think that politics can also solve the problems that are being created, and we do need to have technological progress. Like if we said the same thing during the Industrial Revolution, which people obviously did say, in the end, despite the damage that it created, it was beneficial overall.
The question is whether AI is technology in the same way, whether that analogy holds up. Is AI a tool or is it something else? And, I use it a lot. In fact, I'm going to be giving a really fun 2-day session in Wittenberg, Germany, where Hamlet went to school. And talking about whether AI could be the equivalent of the Roman Catholic Church in the year 1500. It's a powerful tool run by a group of greedy elites. And so that's a human problem. And the problem is if we just simply, and this is with the Luddite factor, where you simply say technology will kill us all, that runs you into it runs you in the wrong direction. What were we talking about before that? I'm so sorry.
About women and how they use rhetoric.
Women.
George Maloney.
Oh my God, I forgot women. All right, if you think so, you can contrast her with Margaret Thatcher. Isn't that a brilliant contrast?
Yeah, it is,
two completely different characters, and yet the two of them had something in common here, and I think this is really interesting. The problem that women have in politics is that they want to run on an ethos strategy. And ethos, according to Aristotle, who wrote the original book on rhetoric that survives, ethos is the most persuasive tool. He said, because of our sorry human nature, logic alone won't persuade people. In fact, it rarely does. Facts won't persuade people. But the trust someone has in either the tribe or the speaker wins the day. The problem that women have is that they get judged on every level to make it almost impossible to use an ethos strategy. Like, you look at a Margaret Thatcher, or you look at a Hillary Clinton more recently, the hardest working woman in politics. Yet the harder she worked, the more people disliked her. I mean, I have a sister-in-law who absolutely detests the woman, even though her politics absolutely agree with everything Hillary Clinton ever said. Now, Margaret Thatcher, she ran as a man in a man's world and overcame men. She did it, as Hillary Clinton tried to do, using a logos strategy, which is the rational strategy, not emotional at all. Emotions took, if she was the most unemotional person, unless she was using anger, ever, right? Now you look in Italy, and here you have a woman who is physically very attractive. She doesn't have to do anything with it. She can run on an entirely logo strategy. Now she can also tap in anger. And women rhetorically can use anger very effectively. If you look at the temperance movement in the United States, against alcohol, that was an anger movement. So women can engage anger because men respect an angry woman. But do they respect a nice woman? Do they respect a happy woman or a funny woman? That's worst of all. They tend not to vote for those people. Now, you do see people throughout history somehow succeeding, but often, if you look in the case of, say, Indira Gandhi, their relatives or their widows of men, and so they take on the mantle of the men. I hope that changes, but I'm seeing very little change.
Okay, now I want to finish by talking about personal development and personality a bit more. So, could you explain what Stoicism actually is and its key ideas? Because a lot of people have become aware of it, especially because it's become so popular in the self help movement and in self help books, podcasts, and things like that. So, what actually is and what are its key ideas?
My latest book is Aristotle's Guide to Self-Persuasion, and I include Stoicism in there. I contrast that with another ancient Greek movement, Epicureanism, which I think is underrated today. Epicureanism is very close to what we understand as Buddhism in the modern world, and it has to do with pursuing happiness, however you define it. Whereas Stoicism, on the other hand, is a life of virtue. And by virtue, that the term comes from the Latin word vir, which means man. So virtue originally meant living nobly in a masculine, manly way, showing courage and strength. And that's why when in the movies the Roman soldiers chant strength and honor, they're actually saying virtue and honor. But virtue doesn't sound so great in Hollywood, so that's why they changed it. But actually, virtue originally kind of meant this sort of, not necessarily the kind of Donald Trump pound the chest kind of manliness, whatever that means, but rather a gentleman, a noble person. Now, Stoicism is all about controlling your emotions, knowing that you can have mastery over them. It's a very masculine concept. Now, of course, women can be Stoics, don't get me wrong, but the idea that when you feel something, that's something you can control. The external circumstances you can't. Now, I'm an Epicurean. I'm not a Stoic. I don't think Stoicism necessarily leads you in a good direction, because it's just like, yeah, you're feeling pain, get over it. And that can really be hurtful to a lot of people. And I see why a lot of men want it, because men are struggling to find a role in society and define what masculinity really is. And Stoicism can really help you do that. And I like a lot of Stoics. I think Marcus Aurelius was an amazing guy, great Stoic, and probably the person Stoics today read the most. Epicureanism, on the other hand, is really interesting because it basically is all about overcoming fears of things. And I think that's what is making a lot of us mentally ill today, how much we fear things. And basically, Epicureanism says you don't need to fear things. The things you fear don't exist. But I think when it comes to self-help originally comes from this wonderful self-progressive attitude, which is that your life can get better and you have some control over it. And Stoicism definitely helps lead you there.
I think I definitely agree with the idea that fear is false. I always say this to people because it's literally just you thinking of something yourself, because it's largely either due to uncertainty or because you don't really know what's going to happen next. So that causes you to feel fear, but it's not really real, right? And I also wanted to ask you, do you think that internal blockages and internal mindsets are the main reason why people fail or why they have barriers to improving themselves? And how can they overcome these internal barriers like fear, like uncertainty?
Well, so again, one of the most important tools of rhetoric is framing. And framing has to do with what the issue is really about, how you define what you're talking about. And so when people talk about success or obstacles or blocks, that's when it can really help to reframe what you're talking about. Like, what is true success? What are you aiming at? Are you aiming at a particular kind of car? Are you aiming at a prestigious place to live, or
These mean
a
something
career?
different to different people, right? Some
Exactly.
people is informed by religious values, some with like consumerism.
Yes, no question. And now religion is really hard to change in a person, and I'm not proposing that people do that. But on the other hand, a lot of your values can change. You can change them. You can have responsibility. You can take responsibility over what you value and what you don't. Or rather, understand a little better what you should be valuing. And I think this, in my case, it does come with age a little bit. In my case, I think partly because I'm a slow learner. Over time, I came to realize that the things I valued the most weren't as important as the things that truly made me happy. That's framing. Now, when you talk about, how people, whether mental blocks keep you from succeeding at what you truly desire, you got to say luck has a lot to do with whether you succeed or not. I've led
Yeah,
a
definitely.
very lucky life. I think that now the framing does come in, though, in that how grateful can you be for that? And I've learned to be very grateful. This idea of expressing gratitude, I think, is a really good idea. Not to the point where you're just doing it for self-healing, but just genuinely feeling grateful is a really good thing. And that's what people often mistake what prayer can be about in almost any religion. Expressing gratitude is not only good for you, but it can also help you reset your values.
Yeah, and it also helps you understand that not every success is down to you. So that means not every failure is also down to you, because a lot of things are down to luck. But society is always trying to tell you that you have control and that if you fail, it's your fault entirely. But that's not true. And if you're successful, that's also not your fault entirely. Even when you see trillionaires and people at the top of society, they aren't entirely successful just because of their own efforts. Society has contributed to them. Other people have contributed to them. And that often
Yeah.
gets lost in the way we talk about this.
No, and here's where we get into real danger in society when we seem to think that people who have acquired a great deal of money by inheriting money or by building an empire or by sheer theft, that God did that. Not just they did it, but God did it. And, we spent centuries under nobility. We freed ourselves from as a modern civilization. And I think we're kind of forgetting how important that is. And by the way, that's the humanist movement. This is the idea that humans can take agency, that they can take control over their own lives, and not everything is written, not everything is up to God. Now, that counters a lot of religious movements that are gaining strength today. And I think that's very dangerous in terms of politics. The American founders came up with this idea that it would be a good idea for both the sake of religion and of politics to separate the two. And now we're seeing the two combined. Now, what's happening with that? When you have someone like an Elon Musk, who's acquired a great deal of money, most of which he acquired through the US government, through money the government gave to fund his businesses, Tesla aside. Here's a brilliant engineer. And personally, I used Starlink for years, and it was awesome. It was really a terrific thing. I've ridden in Teslas. I think they're great cars. That being said, did his acquisition of $1 trillion, is that all up to him? It's not. The US government paid for 2/3 of his wealth. Now, on the other hand, was it up to, God blessing him? I really doubt that God approves of everything he does, regardless of what God you actually believe in. I think that's where the danger comes now is how we frame success. Because, I think when we say either we're blessed by God, so God likes me more than you because I have more money, or I have children and you don't, that's even worse. Or on the other hand, I did it all on my own. I did it my way. Both of those are not just personal evils that will lead you in the wrong direction, but I think more importantly, it's really bad for society.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our discussion. What is one final message that you'd like to leave, just about anything we discussed today, or just in general?
It's easy for me as a privileged old white guy to give my profound opinions and expect people to listen, and I find they do less and less. God bless them. Instead, what I like to do is to leave you with a tool that people find very useful. Whenever you're in an uncomfortable situation, or even thinking about politics in general, think of a bright future and change the tense. Like most people, when they are yelling at each other, speaking the present tense. That's Aristotle said that's the language of values, demonstrative rhetoric, he called it. On the other hand, when people are talking about all the evil you committed in the past and why should we even trust you, That's forensic rhetoric, and that's in the past tense. You'll rarely hear politicians talking about the future or using the future tense. If you and I do that, I mean, if we're in an uncomfortable conversation and you switch to the future saying, call me whatever you want, or yeah, mistakes happened, but let's talk about how to fix things for the future, good things happen and people's mood even changes. So that's the one tool I'll lead you. Switch to the future and describe not a horror, but a future we can do something about to be better than ever.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. We need to return to the politics of utopia. Thanks so much for joining me. Thanks so much for watching and listening, everyone. And if you enjoyed that, please make sure to subscribe and to follow wherever you're listening, wherever you're watching. Share this with your friends and your family. This has been Mission Undercover, and I hope to see you all next time.